What I want to do in this lesson is talk a little bit more and a bit briefly about the core ideas that exist within socialism. And that's what we're going to do, just briefly go over some of the basic presumptions and basic understandings of what a socialist generally would believe. And then in the next lesson we're going to talk about one of the major ideas within socialism, and within socialist ideology, specifically the concept of materialism, historical materialism, class conflict, and also class consciousness. So as an introduction, in the last lesson what we did was looked at how we can define socialism. So we looked at the different ways in which it was defined, a number of basic assumptions that socialism makes, and also some of its early developments. So the tension that existed in the ideology between the kind of between like people like Marx and Engels, and then those of like the utopian socialists, for example. And in this lesson we're going to go and look into more detail about the key ideas within socialism. So don't forget, socialism as its technical definition and a Marxist definition of socialism refers to the common ownership, common ownership of the means of production. So M of P, means of production. Now this is something that that's generally commonly described as the what we would define socialism as. However, as it has developed over years and from Marx into and beyond, okay, the concept of a socialism and socialist ideas tend to be a bit more complex and a little bit more nuanced than that. We don't tend to argue that if the means of production are communally owned, then we definitely have socialism, or we definitely don't have socialism. We tend to be a bit more nuanced in our discussions. We talk about things like redistribution of wealth, redistributive justice, things like things like equality and equity within society. Okay, we think things like worker rights, for example, and so therefore, and also things like class and class conflict and analysing things through the lens of class. So we have a bit more of a complex understanding of what socialism is now than how it was commonly defined back in the days of Marx and Engels. And one of the major ideas within socialism is the material goods and their distribution, the way in which material goods are distributed throughout society. It looks at the nature of material goods. Don't forget, Marx's idea of history is one of a historical materialist. Historical materialism, something we'll get to in the next lesson in a bit more detail. And this includes the desire to distribute material goods equitably. Okay, so we have an equality of distribution, and so that's one of the main ideas within socialism. And this is a major critique of capitalism. So a number of socialists, so this is a major critique of capitalism, because capitalism, as it is unrestricted, for example, things like the free market and free market capitalism, tends to lead to a situation where material goods and things like capital specifically culminate within a select few within society. So the idea of wealth attracting more wealth, and a tendency for particular markets to monopolize, for there to be monopolies within particular markets. And so this leads to a relatively unequal distribution of wealth. And so the idea with socialism is to redistribute wealth based on equitable measurements. The next thing we're going to talk about is the concept of collectivism. Now this is something that distinguishes our understanding of socialism compared to that of for example, liberalism or even conservatism. So our previous studies within liberalism and conservatism, so we had liberalism, and we also had conservatism. Both of these ideologies generally focus on the individual. Specifically in liberalism, the concept of individualism within the liberal thought is something that is incredibly important. However, socialists like to think alternatively. There's the opposite within socialism, sees as socialism looks at collective action, because society, according to a socialist, is enhanced by collectivization, since there is a greater enhancement of economic action. Okay, and this ties into the concept of class consciousness. So the concept of class consciousness, since workers, for example, or the proletariat, will be in a perpetual state of alienation from the fruits of their labor, and we have an example where this situation causes an understanding of their position, of their predicament. And this class consciousness is a collective one. Okay, you do not have a class consciousness on necessarily an individual basis, but it is a general class basis, so amongst a greater group, and that is a collectivist understanding. The final thing I want to touch on is the concept of the state and class systems. So the state is a very interesting example within socialism and within Marxist ideology as well. So the concept of statism is actually quite controversial as well. This is because Marx himself was not a statist. Okay, a number of people make the claim that Marx was a statist, but in fact he wasn't a statist. If you think about and you read and interpret a lot of the works of Karl Marx, there was very little in the way of understanding a future communist society as one with a state, at least in the way we understand the state to be today. So, interestingly, when Marx was writing, okay, he didn't necessarily make a distinction between socialism and communism. He often would use socialism and communism quite interchangeably. So he would use those two, but tending to prefer to use communism. Whenever he did use socialism on its own individually as a specific thing, it was often to critique a lot of those whom he disagreed with within society at the time. So, for example, utopian socialists were an example of where there was a great amount of disagreement. Other socialist thinkers, however, like to argue that the state is important for the maintenance and upholding of socialist ideals. So, for example, as far as can be known, writers like Vladimir Lenin were very supportive of the concept of a state, the existence of a state, or at least in practice, Marxist Leninism became one in which there was the existence of a state, because as Lenin argued, that the state can be a factor, a force in the common ownership of the means of production, that we can use the common ownership of the means of production through the state, because the state is a vehicle for the people, effectively. Now, obviously, we're going to go into Marxist-Leninism in a little bit more detail later on, and his ideas is a little bit more nuanced than that, but generally speaking, Lenin would be more of a statist than Marx, for example. Okay. Finally, the concept of class plays a central role in the relations within society. So don't forget, when we're talking about the concept of materialism and historical materialism, Marx and Engels prefer to use phrases such as dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism. And this is the concept of, for one, the material ownership, the material conditions in which people are understanding, and the material conditions by which history develops, okay, is dialectical in nature. Now, dialectical just refers to opposing forces, okay, opposing forces. Now, this is something that is a Hegelian word, so Marx took this from Hegel. Now, Hegel was a great influence over philosophers such as Marx and also Feuerbach, for example. And Hegelian dialectics is something that Marx sort of took from that philosophy and almost applied in his own way to this concept of historical materialism. And the idea of opposing forces is that history is developed as a conflict between opposing forces. So the common example is whether or not it's the slave versus slave owner, or we could have the serf versus the feudal lord, and then we also have, in Marx and Engels' time specifically, we have the owner class, so we have the workers workers versus the owners, or the bourgeois versus the proletariat. And this is the kind of opposing dialectical forces that exist within the society, and that's how historically things have developed. Now, I think it's important to for people, if they want to get a deeper understanding of Marxist theory, and if they are not intimidated by the task of potentially reading some Marx themselves, it's important that we get an idea of some of the things that we're talking about in here. So when we're talking about things like historical materialism, okay, there are a number of works that you can refer to, and if you want to ever read, if you're ever interested in reading them, it's important that it would be good to look at these particular works. So, for example, in the first case, for writings on historical materialism, my recommendation would be to go to the German ideology, which is a work published by Marx and Engels, and also the Communist Manifesto. Okay. For those who for works on the economy and economic writings, so economic writings, it's obviously important that you look at Capital, Das Kapital, okay? And then there's also other examples. So, for example, when we have there are a number of manuscripts that were written by Marx, okay, and the manuscripts that were written by Marx, so for example, if I can find it here when I'm doing my reading, okay, so we've also got, if we want to look at things like alienation, you've got the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Economic plus philosophic manuscripts. Now, it's important to note that obviously it's not necessary for somebody who's doing A-level political ideas to go deep into all of these pieces of works to understand these ideas in more detail, and nobody would ever expect that to be the case. But if you're somebody who is interested in looking at taking some key quotes and understanding it better, then it's important that we can do this it's important that these are the writings that you can look at. There are others, of course. You've got Critique of the Gotha Program as well, in terms of later political writings that Marx contributed, and generally speaking these are not necessary, but it's also important to do. I noticed that I never did this for when we're doing liberalism and conservatism, so I might do a separate video looking in detail at some of the key writings that a number of philosophers have written. So for example, people like Rawls and John Locke, or Edmund Burke, for example, for the other ideologies. I think that's important to do, just so we have an idea of if anybody wants to go deeper, then they can do. So that's what we've got finished for this lesson, and in the next lesson what we're going to do is talk about historical materialism in more detail. We're going to look at it and look also at class analysis in more detail as well.